You look closely at the global headlines today, and what do you see? A viral outbreak on a luxury cruise ship, a massive geopolitical standoff in the Middle East, crippling energy shortages in Europe.
Right. And on the surface, those just read like the random, tragic misfortunes of a chaotic world. But when we zoom out and actually look at the investigative sources for this explainer, they suggest a much darker, much more structured reality. They're basically asking us to consider that these events aren't isolated accidents at all. They are intersecting gears in a massive, coordinated machine.
So today, we're breaking down the anatomy of a crisis. We're going to examine the data, the official documents, and the stark anomalies that suggest the architecture of our modern emergencies might actually be meticulously designed.
The independent analysts we're profiling today pose this exact, deeply unsettling question. Are we just reacting to natural disasters, or are we being initiated into a totally new global paradigm? When you actually sit down and compare the timeline of official public health mandates with media conditioning and geopolitical power grabs, that whole mainstream narrative of unprecedented random emergencies really starts to fracture. So let's look at where this latest crisis actually began.
Part 1. The cruise ship coincidence. Okay, so in May 2026, the MV Hondias cruise ship becomes the epicenter of an Andes Hantavirus outbreak. You've got a captive population, an invisible threat, international panic. But the analysts we're following point out a deeply disturbing timeline here.
Right. Just look at the blueprint they uncovered. In 1999, The Simpsons specifically name drops Hantavirus. 2012, they feature a fake cruise ship pandemic. Fast forward to 2021, the Nuclear Threat Initiative runs a highly specific monkeypox tabletop simulation literally months before a real outbreak. And then, the 2026 Hondias event perfectly mirrors these exact scenarios.
As an investigator, you literally have to ask yourself, what is the statistical probability of these highly specific situations appearing in pop culture and simulations years in advance? Are we supposed to believe that's just a coincidence? Or, as the sources argue, is it predictive programming?
And to ground this in cold, bureaucratic reality, our sources point straight to the CDC's interim guidance issued for the specific Andes virus investigation.
The protocols they rolled out were swift and severe. We're talking a mandated 42-day monitoring period, strict self-isolation, restricted movement, and it's all legitimized by a checklist of incredibly generic symptoms. Headaches, nausea. The architecture of a lockdown is just instantly reactivated.
And then comes the psychological conditioning. Public health officials and media outlets are currently broadcasting this exact phrase. Low global risk. We are monitoring the situation. Independent analysts are pointing out that this is, word for word, the exact messaging used in early 2020. You tell the public not to panic, you create this false sense of security, right up until the exact moment draconian restrictions are dropped on their heads. Honestly, it's a masterclass in managing public psychology.
Which brings us to part 2, profiting from imperfection.
The sources emphasize something crucial here. A crisis is never just about public health. It's a highly capitalized industry. But to really grasp the sheer scale of the pharmaceutical machinery, they suggest we look at the underlying ideology. They frame this as a profound theological conflict. On one side, you have the evolutionary worldview, the idea that life is just an accident, nature is deeply flawed, and therefore it requires constant, highly profitable intervention from technocratic science.
Right, and you contrast that with intelligent design, the belief that the creator's system is complete and perfectly designed. The sources are essentially arguing that this pharmaceutical premise of endless, forced intervention is a direct ideological challenge to divine authority.
And this isn't just philosophical speculation. For years, anybody questioning these experimental interventions was labeled insane, dangerous even.
But the sources highlight the 2023 U.S. Congress hearings regarding injuries from the HPV vaccine Gardasil. You had victims literally testifying from wheelchairs. According to the analysts, this documented congressional record proved that skepticism of corporate science wasn't crazy at all. It was entirely warranted.
Which brings us to what might be the most chilling piece of evidence highlighted in the source material. It's an undercover video of a Pfizer executive casually stating, "Why don't we just mutate the virus ourselves so we could preemptively develop new vaccines? It is going to be a cash cow for us." Just let that sink in. What happens when evolutionary theory becomes a highly profitable, lab-controlled business model? The sources are asking a really dark question here. Is life being actively mutated just to manufacture a perpetual cycle of disease and cure?
Moving on to part 3, the global architecture.
Because that profit motive, it scales up directly into global governance. The sources map out these major geopolitical checkpoints, starting with the 79th World Health Assembly. It's completely stalled over pathogen sharing systems between wealthy and lower-income nations.
Now, combine that with a shrinking global health budget, the dissolving of USAID under the previous administration, and the current closure of the Strait of Hormuz, triggering massive food and fertilizer insecurity. The analysts argue all of this creates a fractured world that is perfectly primed for a centralized power to step in, order out of chaos.
And this is exactly how a localized outbreak gets leveraged to mandate global restructuring. Think about the MV Hondius cruise ship. It didn't just carry a virus, it carried passengers from 23 different nationalities. Containing that single isolated ship forced 30 different countries to coordinate an emergency response. Analysts point out that this is the ultimate demonstration of what globalists call health interdependence. It proves no nation can maintain its sovereignty during a crisis. You either comply with the global architecture or you're cut off from it entirely.
Which leads into Part 4, Lockdowns Reimagined.
Investigators are arguing that emergency public health powers are rapidly shape-shifting into something much, much broader. Because while the whole world was distracted by the Hantavirus, the International Energy Agency quietly published a report in Paris titled Sheltering from Oil Shocks, and this was formulated right amidst that ongoing conflict in the Strait of Hormuz. The sources suggest this has absolutely nothing to do with protecting public health. It's a blueprint for locking down the global energy grid.
Look at what the source material outlines from the official IEA recommendations, mandating 3 days of remote work per week, cutting international rail and business travel by 50%, restricting car access with alternate day license plates, lowering speed limits, discouraging personal car use altogether.
You have to ask yourself, do these sound like temporary emergency responses, or does this look like a permanent prison grid designed to normalize surveillance and dictate exactly when and where you are allowed to exist?
And the urgency behind it is entirely manufactured. In April 2026, the director of the IAEA publicly stated that Europe has perhaps only 6 weeks of remaining jet fuel supply. 6 weeks. Overnight international travel, whether you're traveling for education, business, a religious pilgrimage, or even a medical emergency, is being transformed from a basic modern right into an extreme luxury strictly reserved for the elite.
Which leaves us hanging on a deeply unsettling question. Think back to 2020. Remember when crude oil hit negative $37 a barrel during the absolute peak of the lockdowns?
Right. Were those previous lockdowns actually a temporary health measure? Or were they a beta test? A permanent blueprint designed to condition the global population to just accept an era of manufactured scarcity, an era where you gladly hand over your basic freedom in exchange for basic survival.
This brings us to Part 5, the theological choice.
When you connect the media programming, the pharmaceutical models, and these energy lockdowns, the analysts suggest we're looking at a singular, terrifying paradigm shift. They define this modern technocratic system as a worldview that actively substitutes divine authority with state-sponsored science.
And the documentary's sources point out that, for the religiously alert, this perfectly echoes the Islamic eschatological framework of the Dajjal, the grand deception. It's a system offering safety, offering cures and order, but the ultimate cost is your spiritual sovereignty. It demands submission to a hyper-controlled, godless grid.
But amidst all the engineered panic, the fear-based news cycles, and these constant threats of endless pandemics and energy starvation, our sources provide a really powerful theological grounding.
They point back to the ancient certainty found in Surah Aal-e-Imran, chapter 3, verse 54. And they plotted, and Allah planned, and Allah is the best of planners. It is a profound reminder that no matter how sophisticated or overwhelming this technocratic blueprint might appear, it is entirely subordinate to a higher divine order.
These crises are converging right now. The architecture of control is being built in plain sight, leveraging our deepest fears of disease and scarcity to mandate global compliance. Accepting these layered control mechanisms is no longer just a passive political act. It is a fundamental spiritual test. As the next global emergency is initiated, you are being forced to choose your reality. Will you submit to the science of the state, or will you trust in the perfection of the Creator?